It was a quiet Tuesday morning when I walked into the bank. The familiar glass doors sliding open in front of me. The cool air conditioning met me as I stepped inside. And I saw the usual bustle of the office, clients chatting softly, a few customers sitting at their desks, and employees moving about in their polished uniforms. It was a scene of efficiency, of professionalism. But today, it wasn't the usual humdrum of office life that caught my attention. No, it was the old man who had just walked through those very same doors. His name was John. An 83-year-old man. Bent with age. Dressed in ragged clothes and sandals that seemed too old for even the worst of weather. He had a large burlap sack slung over his shoulder. The kind one might use to carry groceries or tools. But there was something about the way he carried it that seemed out of place in the modern, sleek environment of the bank. The sack clinked with the sound of coins as he entered. And I could see the curious stares from the other customers. Their eyes flickered with disbelief. Some even shifting uncomfortably in their seats. While others whispered under their breath. And then, just as I had feared, I saw it. A glance from Emma, the young bank clerk at the front desk. Her brow furrowing in a mix of confusion and disdain. She quickly dismissed him with a wave of her hand. The look she gave him, there was no mistaking it. It was the kind of look that you would give someone you thought didn't belong. Someone who had no place here. The young man's ragged appearance and that sack full of loose change made him an immediate target for mockery. The other employees, too, exchanged quick glances. Their whispers cutting through the otherwise polite chatter in the room. "Who's this old man?" one of the staff whispered. Loud enough for all to hear. "Does he think he can just waltz in here with a bag full of coins?" I couldn't help but overhear as I stood at the counter, watching this unfold. My gaze shifted to John as he approached the front desk with determination. His face, weathered with age and hardship, remained calm, his eyes not revealing even the slightest hint of anger or frustration. Despite the obvious disrespect, he simply asked to make a deposit, explaining that the money in the sack was the result of a lifetime's worth of work and accumulation of small, hard-earned savings. But Emma wasn't listening. She wasn't hearing the words, she was seeing the man before her, an old, frail figure with torn clothes and a sack of coins. "We don't accept this kind of deposit," she said curtly. Her voice was flat, dismissive. "You should take that money to a coin exchange." "Not here." John, undeterred, looked her in the eyes. His voice quiet but steady. "Please, young lady, these are the fruits of a lifetime of labor. They mean everything to me. I've worked all my life for this." But Emma was having none of it. She turned her back on him, speaking over her shoulder to one of the other clerks. Mark, the bank manager, who had just walked over. Drawn by the commotion, she quickly explained the situation, as though John were invisible, merely a nuisance, an obstacle to their day-to-day routines. Mark didn't even look at John directly. He simply asked, with a tone that dripped with indifference, "What's this? Is this man really trying to deposit loose change?" Without a second thought, he turned to John, his voice as cold as the marble floors beneath our feet. "We don't have time for this. Your money isn't even worth counting. I'm afraid you'll have to take it elsewhere." It was at that moment I felt something stir inside me, a strange sense of sadness, mixed with anger. How could they be so dismissive? How could they ignore the humanity of this old man, whose whole life had been spent gathering this meager fortune? How could they disregard not only the money he carried but the life behind it? I watched as John remained composed. He wasn't angry, nor was he upset. He simply requested to speak to someone who could help him. He wanted to explain, but his voice was calm, without any trace of indignation. "I just want to put this money in my account," he said gently, "to secure it for my old age." His words, so simple and humble, seemed to hang in the air, almost lost amid the cold, dismissive atmosphere of the bank. But Mark was already turning away, too busy with his own affairs to take any notice of the request. As John stood there, His eyes never left the manager's back. He wasn't angry, just patient. And I couldn't help but admire his dignity. Despite the way he was treated, he didn't let it break him. He held on to his sense of self-worth, even when those around him saw him as insignificant, as nothing more than an old man with a sack of worthless coins. And then I realized something. The scornful glances from the clerks, the whispered comments from the customers, the dismissive tone of Mark, they were all just reflections of something deeper, something insidious. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the way society treats those who are old, poor, or different. It was about the deep-seated belief that one's worth is measured by how much they have, by how much they own, by how polished and well-groomed they are. John was none of those things. But he was something more, something that none of us had yet understood. And as I watched him stand there calm, patient, unwavering, I knew that, somehow, this story was going to change all of us. The tension in the bank grew, almost palpable. John stood quietly, waiting for Mark, the bank manager, to address him. His hands clasped together in front of him like an old man who had seen enough of the world's cruelties to expect nothing. I watched as Mark turned around and spoke to his colleagues in low tones, clearly not interested in taking the time to entertain an old man's petty deposit. "Look," Mark said, as though he were speaking to a child. "We have procedures in place for these kinds of things. He can't just waltz in here with bags of coins, expecting us to sort through them. There's a coin-counting machine for that. We don't have time to do this manually." I could see John's shoulders sag slightly. He wasn't going to argue. The weight of his years and his efforts seemed to settle upon him in that moment. It was as if the world had always rejected him. And this was just another instance in a lifetime of being overlooked, of not being heard. Yet, even in the face of all this dismissal, his resolve remained intact. His voice broke through the quiet murmur of the bank. "I just need to make sure this money is secure, so I can rest easy. I worked for this. Every single penny. It's the last of my savings." There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness, just the quiet, unwavering tone of a man who had worked tirelessly throughout his life, with little recognition, to ensure his own survival. His eyes were steady, looking not at Mark, but at the counter in front of him as if searching for a sign of empathy, a flicker of understanding. But Mark didn't see the man before him. He saw a problem to be solved, an inconvenience that didn't fit into his perfect system. "I'm sorry, but there's no way we can process this. I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he said flatly. A sudden pang of frustration gripped my chest. How could this be happening? Was this man not worthy of just the basic human dignity that we all take for granted? He was asking for nothing extraordinary, just to store his savings for safekeeping. Why was that so hard for Mark to understand? The other customers in the bank had been observing the scene with a mixture of disbelief and amusement. Some were silently whispering among themselves, no doubt judging John's appearance, his ragged clothes, his sack of coins. They probably thought him to be a beggar, a man who didn't belong in such a refined space. A few of them even snickered under their breath. But there was one person who had been watching more intently than anyone else, Emma, the young bank clerk. As the situation dragged on, I could see her expression shift. At first, she had been amused by the spectacle, even joining in the quiet mockery of the old man. But now, as she overheard his calm explanation, something in her changed. She seemed uncomfortable, perhaps realizing that they were all wrong to treat him this way. When Mark turned his back again to deal with other customers, Emma hesitated for a moment, almost as if she wanted to say something, to interject on behalf of John. I caught the flicker of doubt in her eyes, and for the first time, I wondered if she might do something. And then, in a surprising move, she spoke up. "Excuse me, sir," she addressed Mark, her voice shaky but firm. "Maybe we should check the bag, just to be sure. It's worth looking into." Mark looked at her incredulously. "What do you mean?" We don't have time to entertain this old man's nonsense. He's just wasting our time. But Emma seemed resolute. She looked at John. And I could see the apology in her eyes. I'll check the bag. Maybe I was too quick to judge, she said quietly. I watched as Emma approached John. Her steps hesitant at first. The weight of the decision seemed to hang in the air. She reached for the burlap sack. Her fingers brushing against the coarse fabric. John gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. The kind of gesture that said he wasn't expecting much but was grateful for her willingness to listen. As she began to open the bag, I saw the glint of the coins inside. At first, they seemed like an overwhelming sea of loose change. But as Emma carefully poured them out onto the counter, my eyes widened. The sheer amount of money that spilled from the bag was staggering, more than I had ever seen in loose coins. There must have been at least $3 billion in total. Carefully accumulated. A lifetime of hard work and sacrifice. I could see the reactions of the people around me change. Mark's face went pale as the coins continued to spill. The weight of the moment settling in. The other customers, who had been sneering and judging, now fell silent. A profound shift in energy moved through the bank as everyone realized that this wasn't just some old man with a bag of useless coins. No, this was the result of years of labor. Years of struggle. The realization hit hard. Almost like a slap in the face. How foolish they had all been to judge so quickly. To dismiss someone based on appearances. In the next few moments, I saw the shift. The once indifferent, even hostile, atmosphere began to change. Where there had been sneers and laughter, there was now silence. And slowly, a shift toward respect. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't perfect. But it was enough. Emma looked at John once more, her face filled with a mixture of guilt and newfound respect. For the first time since she had seen him, she looked at him as a human being, not a nuisance. Not a problem. But someone with dignity. Someone who had earned every coin that now lay on the counter before her. The realization that the bag of coins before us held more than just loose change began to sink in. The bank, which had once been full of skepticism and superiority, was now stunned into an uncomfortable silence. The clink of the coins hitting the counter seemed deafening in the stillness. As if the sound was an audible reminder of the immense value that had been dismissed so easily just moments before. I could see the transformation in the faces of those around me. Mark, the manager, who had been so quick to dismiss John, now stood motionless, his expression stricken with guilt. His usual calm demeanor had crumbled, and his eyes flickered nervously as he looked at the mountain of coins. It was as if a mirror had been held up to him. And for the first time, he saw how shallow his judgments had been. Emma, too, was visibly affected. The initial discomfort in her eyes was now replaced with something else, a deep sense of shame. As though she was grappling with the consequences of her own actions. She had been the one to suggest checking the bag. But it was clear that the moment she saw the true value of John's life's work, she understood just how wrong she had been. But the real turning point came when John, with his weathered hands, calmly began to recount his story. It wasn't the words themselves that struck me so deeply, but the quiet dignity with which he spoke. I worked all my life, he began, his voice calm, yet carrying the weight of years of struggle. I didn't take anything from anyone. I never had much. But I worked for everything I had. I've picked up cans from the street, sold lottery tickets, and done any work that came my way. This money represents my life. The sweat. The days that I could barely keep going. But I did it because I knew it would matter one day. I looked around at the other customers. The once judgmental gazes that had been so full of contempt were now replaced with something else, a mix of guilt, awe, and even admiration. They had not realized that what they had been seeing all along was not just an old man in tattered clothes, but a man who had lived a life of incredible perseverance. One whose value wasn't defined by wealth or status, but by the sheer strength of his character. Mark seemed to shrink under the weight of John's words. He stood there, silent, His face flushed with embarrassment. His earlier dismissiveness, his callousness, had been exposed for what it truly was, a reflection of his own insecurities. His desire to feel superior in a world that often rewarded appearances over substance. "Do you understand now?" John asked, his voice quiet but firm. "This money isn't just coins. It's a lifetime of hard work. I've saved everything I could. I might be old, but I've never given up. And I don't plan to now." I noticed that the other customers, who had been watching the scene unfold with increasing tension, were now looking at John with a kind of reverence. Some of them looked ashamed, and some even seemed moved, as though they had just witnessed something far more profound than a simple transaction. They had seen a man who had lived with integrity, who had never let his circumstances dictate his worth, and who had earned every penny with the kind of quiet dignity that couldn't be bought or replicated. It was then that Mark stepped forward, his face no longer cold or indifferent. I'm sorry," he said, his voice faltering. "I didn't understand. I was wrong. Please, let me help you." For the first time, Mark's words were not empty. There was sincerity in his apology, a humility that had been absent before. And for John, who had endured so much in his life, it seemed that the moment had finally arrived when his worth was recognized. The respect he had earned, though delayed, was now being offered in the form of real help. Emma also came forward, her face flushed with embarrassment and newfound respect. "I should have never judged you, sir," she said softly. "Please forgive me. I didn't know." John gave her a soft smile, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. "There's nothing to forgive," he said gently. "We all make mistakes. It's not too late to do better. And that's what matters." As I watched this exchange, I realized that John had given us all more than just a lesson in empathy and respect. He had given us a glimpse into what it truly means to live with integrity. His story wasn't about the amount of money he had saved or the circumstances of his life. It was about the quiet perseverance that we often overlook in our rush to judge people based on appearances. John had shown us that true value is not measured by wealth or outward success, but by the effort we put into every day, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem to others. In that moment, the bank transformed from a place of cold, transactional relationships to a space where humanity had a chance to be restored. John, with his humble presence and steadfast spirit, had reminded us of the true worth of a person, a lesson none of us would soon forget. The silence in the bank lingered for a moment longer, like a heavy curtain falling over the room. It wasn't the kind of silence that was uncomfortable, but one that was filled with contemplation, the kind of silence that forces you to reckon with your own thoughts, your own judgments, your own actions. John's presence, so unassuming yet so powerful, seemed to fill the space. It wasn't just his words that had impacted us, it was the way he carried himself. The quiet dignity with which he had endured the years of hardship, and the unwavering belief that he was not defined by his circumstances. His life was not about taking shortcuts or looking for excuses. It was about hard work, day in and day out, even when no one was watching. And it was that very resilience that had earned him the respect he deserved. I saw Mark take a deep breath, as if trying to shake off the weight of his earlier assumptions. He looked at John and then back at the other customers, his eyes scanning the room as if to ensure that everyone was witnessing the change in him. His face, once stern and judgmental, had softened, and he seemed to be searching for the right words to express his regret. But there was nothing that could be said that would truly make up for the harshness he had shown earlier. The only thing that could come close was action, a change in the way he treated not just John, but everyone who crossed his path in the future. Emma stood beside him, her expression one of quiet reflection. I could see that she, too, was processing what had just happened. She had been the one to suggest opening the bag, to try and get a better understanding of what had been in it. And now she stood there, grappling with the reality of the life she had never fully understood. She wasn't just feeling guilty about the way she had treated John, but also about how she had so easily dismissed the struggles of people like him. She realized that John wasn't just some old man trying to deposit a few coins, he was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. A symbol of all the people whose hard work is often overlooked and undervalued. As the bank resumed its activities, there was a noticeable shift in the air. The usual buzz of transactions and small talk seemed less important now, as if the events of the last few minutes had put everything else in perspective. People weren't just rushing to get their business done. There was a newfound sense of respect for the people around them, the quiet, humble ones who might not be noticed at first glance, but who carried the weight of their own stories, their own struggles, their own triumphs. When it was John's turn to finally speak again, he did so with a kind of calm that seemed to resonate with everyone in the room. "I don't need your pity," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I didn't come here looking for recognition. I've lived my life as best as I could. And I don't expect anyone to hand me anything. But I do ask that you remember this, that every person, no matter who they are or where they come from, has a story. And that story is worth hearing." His words hung in the air like a heavy truth, one that no one could ignore. We had all been guilty of reducing people to simple labels: the poor, the homeless, the old, the weak, but John had shown us that these labels are mere illusions. They don't capture the essence of a person's worth. His words weren't just a lesson in respect, they were a call to action. A reminder that we are all part of something greater than ourselves. That we all have a responsibility to treat others with dignity, no matter their circumstances. As the conversation shifted back to the practical matters of his deposit, I couldn't help but notice how different everything felt. There was a new air of warmth in the room, a kind of silent understanding that had formed between John and the rest of us. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about the way he had changed us. Without even trying, he had reminded us of the value of human connection, of the importance of empathy and understanding, of looking beyond the surface and recognizing the humanity in everyone. And so, John left the bank that day not as an old man with a bag of coins, but as a teacher who had imparted a lesson far more valuable than money, a lesson in dignity, respect, and the quiet strength of the human spirit. It was a lesson that would stay with us for the rest of our lives. A lesson that we would carry with us in every interaction, every decision, every judgment we made. The world had not changed, but we had. And that, in the end, was all that truly mattered. As the door to the bank closed behind John, the sense of awe and reflection in the room did not fade. It lingered like a soft echo, a reminder that something deep had shifted in all of us. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in the way people interacted with each other, especially within the confines of the bank. There was a new respect in the air, a kind of gentleness that hadn't been there before. The way we looked at the customers who came through the door was different. It wasn't that we had become excessively sentimental or overly empathetic, but there was a newfound awareness of the human story behind every face. The people who once seemed insignificant or just another number in the line now felt like individuals with lives and experiences of their own. Every wrinkle, every line on their faces, seemed to tell a story, and we were more willing to listen. Even Mark, who had been the most dismissive of all, seemed to have had his eyes opened. At first, I thought it might just be a temporary change, a reaction to the shock of that day. But as time went on, I saw that the transformation in him was real. He began to take more time with clients, asking them questions about their lives instead of rushing them through the process. It wasn't an overt change, but there was a noticeable shift in his demeanor, the way he listened, the way he smiled, the way he looked at people. His attitude had softened, and I believe it was all because of John. I also noticed how the customers responded to this subtle shift. The elderly couple who always seemed to rush through their transactions now lingered for a few extra moments, sharing stories of their grandchildren or of their travels. John had taught us all that these brief interactions were not just business transactions, they were opportunities to connect with others. to see the beauty in the everyday. One day, Emma came to me with a confession. She had been thinking a lot about what had happened, and she realized that John had left an indelible mark on her life. She told me that she had been carrying a lot of judgments with her, not just in the bank, but in her personal life as well. She had grown up in a family that often valued wealth and status over kindness, and it had shaped her view of the world. But after that day with John, she found herself questioning those values. She explained that she had recently come across a homeless woman while walking home from work. Normally, she would have avoided eye contact, perhaps even walked faster to avoid the uncomfortable encounter. But that day, something inside her changed. She stopped and asked the woman if she needed help. They spoke for a few minutes, and Emma bought her a meal. That simple act of kindness, Emma said, had transformed her. It had opened her eyes to the fact that everyone, no matter where they were in life, deserved compassion and respect. I could see the change in Emma. Her eyes had softened, and there was a warmth to her smile that hadn't been there before. She had become more present, more open to the world around her. It was as if she had finally realized that people like John weren't anomalies or exceptions to the rule, they were a part of the fabric of the world we all shared. And just because someone appeared different or had less than others didn't make them any less deserving of kindness. As for myself, the impact of that day with John resonated on a much deeper level. It made me reconsider my own approach to life, to the people around me, and to the way I viewed success and failure. I had always believed that success was defined by status, wealth, and position. But John had shown me that true success was about resilience, perseverance, and staying true to your values. No matter what the world threw your way, I began to spend more time listening to people, understanding their stories, and appreciating the struggles they had overcome. I started volunteering at a local shelter, something I had never thought about before, and when I encountered someone in need, I no longer saw them as a problem to be solved, but as a human being with a history, a heart, and a voice. The lessons that John imparted to us were not just about money or status or the surface-level judgments we often make. They were about the quiet, steadfast dignity of a person who has endured hardship with grace, and the importance of treating every person with the respect they deserve, no matter their circumstances. And in that small, seemingly insignificant moment in the bank, John had given all of us the gift of perspective, a perspective that would shape the rest of our lives. It wasn't just about changing how we saw others, it was about changing how we saw ourselves. Because in learning to respect others, we had also learned to respect our own humanity.